This is the Renegade for Justice podcast, hosted by me, Renegade for Justice, and also Lindsay Floyd. I worked in nonprofit leadership and academic research until domestic violence and a fatal mistake changed everything. My childhood hadn't equipped me with the tools to combat coercive control, domestic violence, and abuse. So when it turned into self-hatred, shame, and reactive abuse, the bottle was all too easy to grab. I had confused my pain, which I didn't understand how to name, with entitlement, and that trauma-bound alcohol use led me to make a negligent choice that started at 3 miles per hour and a shopping cart and ended a man's life. I went to prison and lost custody to my abuser. A decade later, with a 1,900-item docket that traced coercive control and an appellate remand in hand, the trial court still said the clock had run out on justice for me and my daughter. I share my lived experience and the lessons from it because harm is not created in a vacuum. Whether you're experiencing harm from your partner or spouse, from a parent, from your boss, from your government, the harm has tangible weight in each of our lives. As Brene Brown says, pain that doesn't get transformed gets transferred. When I look around this American society that I am a part of, all I can see are relationships organized around harm. Hurt people, hurting people. Hurt people, hurt people. And if we want less hurt, we've got to stop it at the source, not blame the symptoms of the problem as if the symptom created the problem to begin with. I speak about building an internal compass when apology and court orders aren't enough. Naming shame without drowning in it, choosing repair over self-erasure, and then telling the difference between accountability and punishment, order and safety, discomfort and danger. I teach what to do when you've been hurt and when you've done harm, how to validate yourself without excusing yourself, how to turn a hard story into a map toward dignity. Welcome to part 2. Content notice: domestic violence, graphic injury, substance use, and death. I started my part-time serving job last fall and like it as much as anyone likes a part-time job. It allows me to be a mom during the day to my college freshman and toddler, and the family who owns the restaurant is kind and considerate. The schedule's flexible and the customers are nice, and I'm good at my job. This woman came in about a week after I started working there. It was an ordinary shift, nothing remarkable, until she walked in. She looked just like one of my ex-mother-in-law's yaya friends. I'll call her Maggie. Her yaya friends, of course, were the women my mother-in-law surrounded herself with. All of them at the time were in their 60s. Their idea of a good time was drinking and complaining and talking down about other people. They were an ornery, miserable lot, unhappy with everything around them. They were, when I was married to the family, the worst idea of what a white woman is: entitled, privileged, and clueless. But back then, she was a friend to the family. So like all other yayas, I was a friend to her. We vacationed together, with the yaya women all taking to the beach while the yaya men were on some other adventure. The grown children tended to the children of their own, and the dinners emptied all the wine bottles and went into the nights. I saw the yayas during the holidays and knew that it was intentional that they didn't bother whispering when they placed bets on which one of them would be lucky enough to get the next new grandbaby. Seeing her face took me back to the vacations that we shared, the meals. So when this woman walked into the restaurant I worked at, and she looked just like this woman, Maggie, I assumed it was her. It wasn't that far-fetched. I live in the same small town as my ex-mother-in-law, so it's not out of the realm of possibilities for her friend Maggie to visit, to eat out, to cross paths with me. But when I was her server that first day, she didn't recognize me at all. Not even a double glance. She treated me exactly the same as anyone else treats a person who's doing their job, with only as much relevance and kindness as was necessary for the exchange. I figured either it wasn't the same woman, or she didn't want it to be the same person as the girl who used to be married to her best friend's son. Either way, I still had a job to do, so I didn't give it much thought. I just put the déjà vu on the shelf and kept moving. She came back in a week or so later, this time with a man who appeared to be her husband. But the man she was with didn't look anything like the man I had once known to be Maggie's husband. When they paid that night, they used her card. I learned her name was indeed Maggie, but she had a different last name than I had known the years ago. Again, just as before, I assumed it was either a different Maggie with an uncanny resemblance to the woman I used to know, or it was the same Maggie, and she either couldn't or didn't want to remember me. And just as before, I still had a job to do and wasn't going to go ruffle feathers that didn't need ruffling. I filed it under coincidence and left it alone. This woman, the must not be Maggie woman, has come in over a dozen times in the past year. I've served her food, given her recommendations on pairing cocktails with meals, and offered small tokens of kindness and advice when it was appropriate for my server self to do so. Last winter, she forgot her sweater, and I was able to catch them in the car just as they were about to pull out of the parking lot. She and her husband tipped a solid and consistent 20% every time they came in, just like most of the regulars. And so over the course of months, after she continued to just see me as her server, I assumed it simply had to be a different Maggie. At one point, she even mentioned living just down the road, which further reinforced my suspicion that there just must be two Maggie lookalikes, both living in the same time in the same country. The mystery was unresolved, but life went on. About a week ago, her husband came in alone for a pickup order. He looked as if he had just seen a ghost. Pale, hair askew, disheveled and distracted. I asked if he was okay, and he explained that he was, but Maggie had gotten in a car wreck. She was okay in the sense of being alive, but she had several injuries, including a broken bone in her arm that required surgery. For some number of hours that day, he had waited in fear in an emergency room. The ER, of course, had been crowded and busy, so they had to wait hours to get her x-rays and CAT scans back. The bruising had suggested some pretty severe internal bleeding, and he had been fearing the worst. I saw the fear in his eyes as he explained his day to me. I could tell that, for some time, he had thought his wife might die. "She's in the car," he said, and she wanted her favorite meal. I gave him a big hug and felt the relief he experienced at feeling seen. "Oh, thank you," he said as he hugged me back. We embraced as good friends do, with intention and humanity. He thanked me again and chuckled how badly he needed that hug. I told him to give my best to Maggie and hoped for her swift recovery and their peaceful evening. Then I went back to work. She came back with a few girlfriends a few days later, just a few days ago. Her arm was still in a temporary splint-type cast, and she was walking the way a person does when they've just been reminded about how fragile their bodies really are, carefully. She sat down and announced that all she wanted was wine, a sauvignon blanc. As usual, I was their server and I did my job, seeing to them and my other tables. Earlier that morning, I'd been in court, and I got a result I didn't expect. I'll unpack all that in a later episode, but for now, here's what matters in this scene. Until that morning last week, I was under the impression that the hundreds of hours I was investing in preparing for that hearing was going to yield a certain result. The judge, and new to me, whom I had never seen before, had handed down quite an unexpected and different result. One that left my body feeling vulnerable in the way that a butterfly must feel in the minutes after it emerges from its cocoon, its wings still unpracticed and new, but holding the promise of something so much bigger and better than I had ever known. More about this in another episode, but the relevant piece is that I myself, on this particular day, when Maggie came in and the cast was on her arm, I was feeling so many new emotions and experiences internally that I wasn't really focusing on my job with any real mental effort. I was doing my job and doing it well, but internally I was trying on these new emotions like clothing, twirling about in immunity as if it were a ball gown. The night moved on and most of my tables left, but Maggie was still sitting at the table on the patio. 2 of her girlfriends had left and her husband had joined, as well as another local guy. I brought more rounds, welcomed the men, tackled the side work. When I brought out the husband's meal, I commented on how he looked a lot more put together, and he thanked me again for the hug last week, sharing how frazzled he had been the day of her accident. We were friendly. It was easy. "You know," he said, "I feel embarrassed to ask. What's your name?" One of the women at the table interrupted, "Don't feel bad. She doesn't know all our names." At the time, there were 5 of them at the table, and I went around, locking eyes with each of them as I said their names with a smile. They were all impressed, although their drunken applause probably sounded better in their own minds than it did to me. After I told them my name, they all said it over and over again, taking turns. "Thank you, Lindsay," and "Yes, thank you, Lindsay, thank you, Lindsay, Lindsay." It turned into a playful jibe for them, bouncing my name back and forth into their mouths like a ping pong ball in a game of beer pong gone wrong. I let them have their fun. The next time I went out to the patio to bring their bill, the husband confessed that, since they had learned my name, they'd been playing another little fun game. Now, ordinarily, that would have been a red flag to me to boundary up and go on high guard. That little fun game comment is manipulation code. Whatever he's about to ask, I already know he shouldn't be asking. And ordinarily, had it not been for my just realized I'm not in a cocoon anymore-ness, I would have spat down some witty retort about how my pay grade doesn't include games. I live in a small town. The kind of small town where people talk and everyone knows everything about everyone. When I moved here in 2019 to be closer to my daughter, I quickly realized that everyone in town had already heard his version of me. And since I am really responsible for the loss of a human life, my end of the story doesn't need too much embellishing to sound bad. I also knew what kind of human he is, and that any truth that did exist in his version had been amplified and twisted to maximize his victimhood, likely glazing over his arrests and wrongful conspiracy. I saw the way people looked at me. I saw their fear. At first, those years ago, my strategy was to kill with kindness. At the time, I was still on parole. I was still vying for custody of my daughter. I simply had too many things pushing me into the narrow center of the line. Over time, I've learned how to steer conversations if I want to avoid the topic of prison or my personal life. It's not that I try to hide it per se, it's just that a PTA meeting or a grocery store line is a complicated place to correct someone when they say something uninformed about people who are incarcerated or who commit crimes. So I've learned to be selective with whom I choose to share my world with. Ordinarily, customers are not on that list. Don't shit where you eat, they say. I was there to work. But that night, I took his bait. "Oh," I feigned interest, knowing it would not be anything remotely interesting. They explained that they'd been guessing my age. I cut to their chase and announced I was 40. And they all lost their bet, whatever it was, with the closest person guessing 37. Unamused and unflattered, I chuckled at their fun game, set the bill on the table, and turned to leave. "Lindsay," the husband said with a pause, in my name, "do you have kids?" Maggie chimed in. "Yeah, we know nothing about you. Come sit down." She gestured toward the open chair at the table. I reminded myself of the same thing. I remembered in prison, whenever I felt nervous, what I might say in an unfamiliar situation. No matter what happened, I'd likely never see these people again. There was a liberating humor to that. And in the case of this Maggie and her group at the table of the restaurant where I work, well, I know a lot of things about my own life that she and her table mates don't know. Like how I'll be making big changes in my life soon, and sooner than she realizes, I'll find myself in the fortunate position of saying goodbye to this tiny town forever. So in my head, I thought, fuck it, let's poke this sleeping hyena. I pulled out the chair. So I sat and I answered a few questions. When asked why there's a 15-year gap between my children's ages, I glazed over the bulk of the detail and instead just said, life got in the way. Then Maggie asked me their names. I told the names of my children. Then Maggie said, oh, how interesting. My best friend's granddaughter has that same name. In that moment, in an instant, I knew it was the Maggie I thought it was. It was the Yaya Maggie, the one who had been at my wedding in 2006 and who had been there all those times when my brother-in-law ruined vacations. The one where the one who was my best friend, the best friend to my ex-mother-in-law. The one who presumably had listened to her best friend gripe about every single penny she spent when she agreed to pay for an attorney for her son when I took him to court for custody. The same court custody dispute that had lasted a decade, costing her money every single time something happened on the docket, all 1,900 times. That same Maggie who had likely listened to him complain. The one who was likely part of many conversations in the nuclear fallout level disaster that was the aftermath of our relationship, where entire piles of people hate stormed my name. Based on the language I had heard directly from him and his mother, I could only assume that Maggie had heard all sorts of things about the monster I am or was or will always be or has always been in her mind. The same Maggie who cried on my shoulder all those years ago when she got too drunk and missed her dead mother. But the Yaya Maggie hadn't made the connection yet. It took a painfully slow, clarifying question and conversation. No, Yaya Maggie said. I said my best friend's granddaughter, not your daughter. It's her that I'm talking about, my best friend's granddaughter. She shared my daughter's birth name. I know, I responded. That's my daughter. Then I saw it. I saw the very moment where the two separate synapses in her brain that had not yet been connected suddenly united and fired together, merging the two worlds of her brain, and in that very moment, she connected the Lindsay she knew in her brain as the server at her favorite local restaurant to the other Lindsay she knew in her brain, the deadbeat boozer of a cheating wife who killed that poor innocent guy when she was drunk, the one who must have abused her poor best friend's the one who must have abused her poor best friend's golden child son, framed him, must have paid the cops off to get him arrested. The Lindsay who took her best friend's son to court, fighting over custody for more than a decade, costing her best friend a significant chunk of change, at her choosing, of course. He could have represented himself, as I did. But then, no, he couldn't have. Because he's not like the Lindsay that refused to disappear, despite their family's persuasive letter to the Board of Pardons and Parole that I be locked away forever. And instead, I bought a house just a few miles from her best friend's house in that same school district as that same granddaughter, that same Lindsay who just refused to give up on being a mother, despite Yaya Maggie's best friend's deepest desires, which aligned with her son, who, in his words, called his ex-wife a bovine idiot in a text to her. That Lindsay, that bovine idiot, was suddenly standing before her. And she had mixed 2 glasses of wine of sauvignon blanc on an empty stomach alongside whatever prescription goodies the doctors had given her. To say she was shocked does not at all explain the look of magnitudinal level terror on her face. She looked like Edvard Munch's The Scream, stretched over a Greek mask style of tragedy. She was Kevin McAllister with his hands on the face and the scream of the sting and shock of aftershave. wide-eyed, with each eye socket glaring open, like how newborn babies' mouths root for a nipple, their mouths open, wide and searching. Her mouth, frozen open and round, as if emitting a silent scream. Any blood that had been circulating in her body had dropped to her limbs, freezing her like a statue, leaving her face a deadly pale white. It was existential dread. There I was, right in front of her, a living, breathing murderer, a convict, a felon, someone who's done the kind of time that scares the shit out of yayas like her. Because that's how he told the story. So that's how his mother told the story. So that's how Maggie heard it and told it too, when she gossiped to her other yayas, and how her other lunch buddies got to hear about that juicy story involving her best friend's son and that crazy ex of his who went to prison. Echoes become facts in small towns filled with flying monkeys. It was clear to me, too, that everyone at the table had also made the same connection that Yaya Maggie had just made, because they've heard all those stories, too. And they, too, were standing in front of not only that kind, empathetic, excellent server who they've all adored, but also a living, breathing killer. And I had been there, hiding in plain sight this entire time. Both truths can exist. I had never denied that truth. I just hadn't walked in wearing it as a scarlet letter. Having been in worse moments of uncomfortable silence, and knowing that this was likely their first, I chose to take delight in the silence that was screaming out of all of their faces. I grinned authentically, because I saw in their faces the truth that I know myself better and deeper than they'll ever know themselves. And because I knew that I had been hurt far worse and far deeper before, and I have so many fucking tools to cope with things far bigger than other people's manipulated Mandela effect. Their discomfort and horror and shock and confusion, was not my problem, and I wasn't going to give it energy. Instead, I marveled at how little I had to do to make their night unforgettable, knowing for certain they'd never have any trouble remembering my name. After I sat in their discomfort like a nice jacuzzi, I said, "Yes, your best friend's granddaughter is my daughter. Your best friend used to be my mother-in-law, and you were at that wedding." And it was at that moment that I took the time to lock eyes with each of them with a smile. I am still your server tonight on this beautiful evening, and you've still eaten lovely food and enjoyed delightful drinks, and I'm going to go home after this and put my son to sleep. I've left the check on the table. I'll give you some time to look over it. And then I said each of their names as I smiled. I smiled with soft eyes, and then I turned, walked inside. Some while later, they came inside, thanked the other staff and I for a lovely evening, and left with smiles and lazy waves in the air. They left 20%. The current system simply generates punishments in terms of reinforcing its own order and power so it can declare justice served and move on. It stamps the papers and puts the pegs in the holes. But justice isn't served in courthouses. It's tested at kitchen tables, on job sites, in small towns where everyone's heard a version of the story. Most people who go through the system are harmed by it, leave it, and then have to figure out how to live anyway. The work is simple and hard. Tell the truth, stop the bleeding, repair what can be repaired, and don't throw people away. That's how harm declines. Harm increases when we shame people. Harm increases when we expect everyone to force themselves into some false stereotype of what or who an American or human ought to be. Harm increases when we deny the reality that perpetrators, convicts, inmates, felons, and even us killers have just as rich of an internal experience, filled with complex and conflicting emotions, hopes and dreams and fears, just like you. Harm increases when we tell someone, anyone, that their experience matters less than someone else's, that their life or death means more than someone else's. We each get one life, and all of them have equal value. No, they're not all the same, but the worth of every human being is the same, and that is to say, infinite. To say anything else is blasphemous to the reality of human experience. What breaks my heart is how crime is so predictable, or more specifically, criminality, the degree to which a person is likely to commit a crime. It's a universal formula, and one that anyone can succumb to. Just add pain. It's even more effective if the pain is unpredictable or unanticipatable. Not like an elderly grandparent looming at the gate of a natural death in their sleep, but instead it's a grandparent playing outside of her Brooklyn apartment with her toddler grandson and having a fluke brick fall down from the top of the building, killing the grandson instantly. Add that kind of pain into a person's life and they become a candidate for criminality. To close the deal, deny that person's pain, tangle it in bureaucratic tape, delay it through procedure, deny it entirely. If I wanted to, I could create an entire legion of criminals. I learned how from my abuser and from the Department of Justice. All that has to be done is to amplify a person's pain. Take away the things that encourage them upward on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and magnify their pain. Make the person talk about it, but don't give resolution. Give them a process to go through with the potential of a solution, but never actually provide one. Leave that carrot dangling in front of them, just a touch out of reach, leaving it always close enough for the promise. And then call you stupid for not being able to get the carrot. Wear them down, wear them thin, plant seeds of doubt, and pour shame liberally. It all boils down to one message. You and your pain don't matter. And then just leave that pain, poked and prodded and fiery hot, right there. Leave it out in the open, gaping and bleeding. Then tell the person they're not in pain. Now you've got a criminal. On a final note, Maggie's husband came into the restaurant alone last night. He sat at the bar and I went through the usual server motions. About halfway through his meal, he looked at me and he said, "Hey, that's pretty wild how you used to know Maggie and everything." A statement, not a question. It's a small world, I tell him. He shrugs and nods, takes a bite. "And you really didn't know it was her?" he asked. I told him how I was certain it was her the first time she came in, but how, over time, I saw more and more cues that maybe it wasn't her, that maybe it was just a doppelganger, and that it didn't seem like the kind of thing that needed pressing. All of that was true. I imagine what it might have looked like had I forced Maggie to recognize me the first time when I saw her a year ago. I might have said, "Maggie, you're the best friend of the queenest, most beest narcissist queen bee I've ever met. And you're still her flying monkey. You're that Maggie, right? I'm sure you believe all the stories you heard are true, so my guess is that you'd rather sit in a different server's section than the one who refused to let your best friend's son abuse go unnoticed. Since confronting me, my pleasant disposition and my impeccable customer service will unhinge your fixed view of the world that poses you and your yaya friends on top and me at the bottom. But my sweet Maggie, I'm the only server here, so you can either choose to acknowledge and accept a new reality with me, or you can turn around and leave." I like the real version better, the one where I got to see internalized justice shift in real time. Because in that moment, the one where she was sitting in the patio chair, leaning both elbows on the armrests with her hands pointed toward the sky, one in a cast, the other holding her glass of wine. the one where her mouth hung open like an opera singer's final note, as if to let all the bats of her misconception and errored thinking out of her mind and into the night, into the moment that truth spoke for itself.